Japanese captains and crews are thrown to the decks as waves crash against the hulls of their vessels. Above, Allied aircraft peel away, seemingly retreating. Hope flickers among some sailors. Perhaps the enemy has exhausted their ammunition. However, others realize what really is happening. Something far worse is coming their way. It's March 1943, and Japan's fleet is about to face one of the most gruesome assaults it's ever encountered at open sea. As the convoy struggles to reform, a new wave of aircraft appears, streaking toward them at mast height. Engines work at top speed as the Beaufighters descend, their cannons ready to shoot. Fire quickly rips through decks, silencing anti-aircraft defenses and leaving any hope for survival behind. Yet the nightmare is far from over. A third wave looms on the horizon. American bombers close in to deliver the last strike. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, later declared, quote, "It cannot fail to go down in history as one of the most complete and annihilating combats of all time." From the sidelines to the front lines. By the end of 1941, Europe was collapsing under the unstoppable march of Nazi forces, spreading like wildfire across the continent. Just a month earlier, Germany had renewed its military pact with Italy and Japan, solidifying the devastating Axis alliance as the Blitzkrieg turned eastward, tearing into the Soviet Union, its biggest prey yet. And still, on the other side of the globe, the focus of the American people was fixed on a football game between the Brooklyn Dodgers and the New York Giants. For the public, the war was Europe's problem to deal with. The haunting memories of the Great War's carnage were still too fresh, too painful to entertain the thought of plunging into another global conflict. On December 7, 1941, America could no longer afford to look the other way. As the crowd roared in the NFL stadium, and radio commentators excitedly described players charging down the field, passing the 27th-yard line with ball in hand, at precisely 2:26 p.m., the game was interrupted by a voice that carried the message the country had been fearing, quote, "The White House announces Japanese attacks on Pearl Harbor." In a calculated surprise attack, waves of Japanese bombers rained down the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Battleships were torn apart, columns of black smoke obscuring the blue skies of Hawaii as officials fought tooth and nail just to stay alive. By the end of the assault, 21 ships were either sunk or crippled, 188 aircraft reduced to twisted wreckage, and over 2,400 lives lost. There was no escape, no neutral ground to retreat to. The day after the attack, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the nation with unwavering resolve, quote, "The people of the United States have already formed their opinions and well understand the implications to the very life and safety of our nation." The fear was great, but the fury was greater. America's long-held desire to avoid the horror of the war gave way to the realization that the only way to survive was to fight. The time had come to rise against the Axis and settle a personal score with Japan. Position to strike. Foreseeing the storm of war, President Roosevelt had begun drafting young men into the armed forces even before the United States officially entered the conflict. Most recruits, nearly 2/3 of them, had never held a rifle in their lives, much less experienced the battlefield of war. Many questioned if these men could ever stand against the Axis powers, but the trial of fire at the front lines during the year upon the Pearl Harbor tragedy had forged these untested cadets into hardened soldiers. When the chance for retribution arrived, they were ready to strike. The opportunity came in March 1943. The Japanese fleet, seeking to cement its dominance in the region, was transporting thousands of troops and critical supplies toward Port Moresby. They aimed to tighten their grip on New Guinea and secure an Axis stronghold from which they could threaten Australia and the Pacific theater. From a careful distance, the Allied coast watchers had been keeping an eye on Japan's every move. The watchers, stationed along critical points in the Pacific, tracked Japanese convoys, noting their routes and relaying crucial intelligence. With these reports in hand, Allied forces worked day and night to intercept Japanese communications, piecing together the enemy's movements and plotting a strategy to go straight for a fatal strike. On March 1st, reconnaissance efforts began. A patrolling US B-24 Liberator sliced through the Pacific skies, its crew scanning the endless expanse of ocean for any sign of the enemy fleet. Then, a breakthrough. A convoy of Japanese ships, unmistakable against the blue waters, heading toward the ports of Leh and Salamaua in New Guinea. But the Pacific proved to be a treacherous force. A sudden turn in the weather transformed the reconnaissance mission into a quest to remain airborne. The skies churned with storm clouds, winds howled in every direction, and sheets of rain pounded the Liberator's fuselage. Visibility dropped to near zero as the storm engulfed the convoy. The crew fought to steady the aircraft and maintain eyesight with the enemy convoy, but as clouds wrapped around them, the Japanese fleet vanished, forcing the plane to come back to base empty-handed. Yet failure was not an option. The following day, a new wave of reconnaissance aircraft took to the skies, determined to pick up the trail. Pilots scoured the vast expanse of the Pacific. Then, a miracle emerged. Dark shapes began to be drawn on the horizon. The Japanese ships had been found. The bounty was even better than what the Americans were hoping for. 16 vessels sailing in tight formation, carrying nearly 7,000 troops and vital cargo. The convoy was escorted by 8 destroyers and protected by a screen of Japanese Zero fighters, Mitsubishi's long-range aircraft. This was no ordinary target. This was the fleet sustaining Japan's ambitions for Pacific dominion. To allow it to slip away would mean ceding control of the region to the Axis. The Americans had found their mark, and now it was their turn to launch a coordinated aerial assault against Japanese vessels. It was time for America to strike back. The battle begins. Teaming up with the Royal Australian Air Force, the U.S. 5th Air Force prepared to unleash one of the biggest aerial assaults the Pacific had ever witnessed. The first move was not to strike directly at the convoy, but to neutralize its protective air shield. RAAF No. 22 Squadron took the lead, launching a dawn raid on Leh Airfield. Bombs rained down on runways and hangars, leaving the airstrips scorched and unusable. The attack effectively grounded Japanese reinforcements, clearing the skies for the Allies to advance. As the convoy advanced, the U.S. B-17 Flying Fortresses got in position. The bombers released their charges in a high-altitude assault against the convoy. One of the first victims was the nearly 5,500-ton ship Kyokusei Maru. Explosions tore through the vessel, sending torrents of seawater flooding its compartments. Hundreds of sailors, aware that sinking was inevitable, leaped into the waters. The destroyers Yukikaze and Asagumo raced to the scene, plucking 950 survivors from the shipwreck, while the American pilots circled above, continuing their campaign against the convoy. But the Japanese fleet, now fully aware of the threat, scrambled into a defensive formation. Ships weaved and turned with agility, dodging further strikes as the Pacific sky dimmed into night, hiding their position. The Americans, however, were prepared for this. As darkness enveloped the ocean, the Allies deployed Catalina flying boats from RAAF No. 11 Squadron to stalk the convoy through the night. The Catalinas hovered above the waves, tracking every movement and ensuring the enemy's escape was impossible. Yet, the Japanese convoy seemed to be slipping through the Allied net, inching ever closer to safety. In a solo maneuver, a Beaufort bomber from No. 100 Squadron struck as the convoy transited the dangerous Vitiaz Strait, just northeast of New Guinea. Launching a torpedo through the darkness, the lone bomber attempted to halt the convoy's progress, but the strike was lost to the sea, with the Japanese sailing past it, now a step closer to their destination. If the Americans were to claim victory, they would need to up their attack. The time for conservative strikes was over. What was required now was an all-out assault to take down as many ships as possible. The Allies strike back. As the sun rose over the horizon, so did 8 RAAF Beaufort bombers from No. 100 Squadron. Below, Japanese sailors aboard the convoy tightened their grips on their stations, bracing for the inevitable strike. The bombers descended with unmistakable intent, but fate offered the convoy a last chance to escape. Each torpedo missed its mark, skimming past the hulls of the ships. For a moment, hope flickered in the hearts of the Japanese sailors. They could almost envision a miraculous escape, their precious cargo secured. But that hope was short-lived. Miles away, at a rendezvous point near Cape Ward Hunt, Allied forces gathered over 90 aircraft in preparation for a complex synchronized assault consisting of a 3-wave strike designed to shatter the convoy's defenses. By mid-morning, the first wave appeared in the skies. 13 US B-17 flying fortresses, their massive forms casting shadows over the convoy below. From 7,000 feet, the bombers unleashed their payloads, 100-pound demolition bombs tumbling down. Below deck, Japanese troops felt the full wrath of the assault. Explosions rocked the hulls, sending shockwaves through the steel walls. Supplies were hurled across compartments, and men were thrown to the ground as the ship shuddered under the bombardment. Above deck, officers shouted frantic orders, their voices barely audible over the chaos. Ships veered to evade the bomb storm, the tight formation slowly breaking apart. As the convoy struggled to regroup, a new menace materialized on the horizon. 13 RAAF Beaufighters from No. 30 Squadron sped toward the ships, flying just above the waves. To the Japanese captains, the low-flying aircraft appeared to be staging a torpedo attack. Orders were shouted to turn the ships head-on toward the incoming planes, presenting smaller profiles to the attackers. It was a fatal mistake. The Beaufighters, armed with nose-mounted 20mm cannons and machine guns, swooped down to mast height, closing in at over 260 miles per hour. Then, the Australians opened fire. Streams of tracer rounds ripped through the air, shredding everything in their path. Bridges were obliterated in a hail of bullets, officers and crew falling to the ground. Anti-aircraft gunners were silenced, their positions torn apart by the enemy. The final wave. As the Beaufighters disappeared into the distance, the third wave bore down on the convoy. 13 US B-25 Mitchell bombers thundered in at medium altitude, followed closely by a dozen specially modified Mitchells. These bombers flew in with a set mission, their bombs skipping across the water's surface like stones before slamming into the hulls of the Japanese ships. Explosions ripped through the convoy as fuel stores and ammunition ignited. One by one, the ships succumbed to the Americans. US Boston bombers swooped in to finish the job, targeting the now dispersed and damaged ships. The remaining Japanese vessels, bleeding and burning, were easy prey for the Allied attackers. Above the chaos on the water, Japanese Zero fighters scrambled to intercept the attackers, but they were met by a swarm of P-38 Lightnings. The American pilots engaged in mortal dogfights, claiming 20 enemy aircraft at the cost of 3 of their own. The terrible yet essential finale. By the early hours of March 4th, the Japanese convoy had been defeated. The few surviving ships struggled to escape their relentless chasers, but the Allies had no intention of allowing even a shred of the convoy to slip through their grasp. The US Navy dispatched a group of PT boats to scour the area and deliver the final hit to the remnants of the Japanese fleet. Among the broken vessels, Oigawa Maru became an immediate target for PT-143 and PT-150. Already hurt from the aerial bombardments, her crew found themselves defenseless against the torpedoes from their enemies. Sailors could only leap overboard into the oil-stained sea as their ship broke apart. By the time the battle ended, the Japanese fleet had been completely destroyed. All 8 troop transports and 4 destroyers were scrapped, along with nearly 3,000 troops and sailors, marking a turning point in the Pacific, one from which the Japanese would never fully recover. America had succeeded in avenging the lives lost at Pearl Harbor, but victory came with a heavy price. As historian Douglas Gillison described it, the following days were marked by, quote, a terrible yet essential finale. Allied RAAF and USAAF aircraft patrolled the Huon Gulf, hunting down any barges, rafts, or lifeboats carrying survivors from the wreckage, marking a dark end to the battle that secured the region from the grasp of the Axis.